The echoing hall of Xylar blazed with ceremonial light, its vast crystalline dome capturing and refracting the glow of 1,000 bioluminescent orbs. The air hummed with psychic energy, a background drone that set human teeth on edge but served as comforting white noise to the assembled Xylarian nobility. Elaborate murals depicting the species' ascension to psionic mastery and galactic dominance lined the walls, each depicting humans and other primitive species in increasingly unflattering postures of subjugation or bewilderment. Princess Lyranaya stood at the center of the hall, resplendent in her ceremonial psionic amplification armor. The semi-translucent crystalline plates shifted colors with her breathing, azure blue in calm moments, flickering toward violet as her anticipation grew. The armor wasn't simply decorative. It served as both a status symbol and a sophisticated psionic amplifier, broadcasting her already formidable mental powers to intimidating levels. The neural interface connecting directly to her cerebral cortex allowed for instantaneous psionic response, far faster than mere verbal commands. The human representative approaches, "Your Highness," announced First Chamberlain Vexlor, his telepathic voice carrying a note of disdain that echoed Lyranaya's own feelings. She nodded slightly, the motion causing ripples of energy to cascade through her armor. How quaint that they still send these specimens for the ritual of will assertion. One would think after the last 3 demonstrations they might reconsider. Lyranaya was young by Xylarian standards, merely 83 planetary cycles. But as the heir to the stellar throne and possessor of the most potent psionic potential measured in 3 generations, she commanded respect far beyond her years. She had been raised to believe in Xylarian superiority as an absolute truth, as immutable as gravity. Humans, with their clumsy physical bodies and crude technology, were barely more than clever animals to her people. The massive doors at the far end of the hall parted with ceremonial slowness. Sergeant Marcus Thorne of the Terran Federation strode forward, his standard-issue military uniform looking absurdly utilitarian against the organic, flowing architecture of the hall. His boots echoed on the crystalline floor with dull thuds that seemed to emphasize his physical, earthbound nature. Lyranaya scanned him with both her eyes and her mind. Medium height, muscular but unexceptional build, close-cropped brown hair, weathered face with lines that spoke of both hardship and humor. His uniform was impeccably maintained, but fundamentally primitive. Fabric and composites rather than the living, responsive materials favored by Xylarians. No visible weapons, as per protocol, though she detected several small devices clipped to his belt that registered as communication and defensive equipment. What struck her most was his expression, calm, watchful, even slightly bored. It lacked the appropriate awe and intimidation she expected from lesser species in the echoing hall. Sergeant Marcus Thorne, representing the Terran Federation for the ritual of will assertion, announced the protocol officer, the words simultaneously spoken and telepathically broadcast. Thorne stopped at the prescribed distance and offered a crisp but minimal bow, exactly to the letter of diplomatic protocol, without an inch of additional deference. "Your Highness," he said simply, his voice carrying a faint accent from some Terran subregion. Lyranaya did not return the greeting. Instead, she sent a preliminary psionic probe toward his mind. Not an attack, merely a casual inspection, like a predator circling potential prey. "Humans still send soldiers rather than psionics," she observed, her actual voice musical and clear, while her telepathic undertone carried notes of mockery. "Does your species still lack mentally evolved individuals capable of participating meaningfully in this ritual?" Around the hall, several Xylarian nobles permitted themselves small smiles or telepathic ripples of amusement. The ritual of will assertion was, technically, a diplomatic ceremony designed to demonstrate cultural exchange and relative capabilities without resorting to actual warfare. In reality, everyone knew it was a glorified power display, particularly for the Xylarians to remind lesser races of their place in the galactic hierarchy. Thorne's expression remained neutral. The Federation sends representatives considered most appropriate for each exchange. I was deemed suitable for today's ritual. How diplomatic, Lyranaya smiled coldly. Shall we begin then? I would not wish to prolong this formality longer than necessary. With a subtle gesture, the ceremonial arena activated. A circular area around them glowed with soft blue light, establishing the boundaries of their demonstration. By tradition, the Xylarian representative always initiated the exchange. Lyranaya didn't waste time. She sent a focused pulse of telepathic energy directly at Thorn's consciousness. Not enough to harm, but certainly enough to disorient and intimidate. Along with it, she projected a series of deliberately humiliating images. Humans stumbling with primitive tools, falling before Xylarian might, acting like the apes from which they had barely evolved. These projections rippled outward, allowing the assembled Xylarian nobility to witness her mockery. Your species still uses combustion engines and silicon chips. Her telepathic voice dripped with disdain. While we manipulate the fundamental energies of consciousness itself. How do you not collapse from shame at such inferiority? She expected him to stagger, to clutch his head, perhaps even to fall to his knees, as the previous human representative had done 3 cycles ago. Instead, Thorn merely blinked rapidly several times, shook his head slightly, and remained standing. Lirania Frovnid. She increased the intensity of her psionic thrust, focusing particularly on the centers of balance and orientation in his primitive human brain. Thorn swayed slightly, but kept his footing. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead, but his eyes remained clear and focused on hers. Interesting, he said quietly. Your telepathic signal seems to have some interference. Lyranaya's eyes narrowed. Impossible. My psionic rating is above the 99th percentile, even among Xylarians. Your mind should be like tissue paper to my will. For the first time, Thorn allowed himself a small, tight smile. He tapped the collar of his uniform. Standard issue psionic dampening mesh. Nothing fancy, just enough to create some static on the line, so to speak. Standard equipment for Terran soldiers for the past decade. A murmur, both audible and telepathic, rippled through the observing crowd. Lyranaya felt the first flicker of annoyance. The human should have crumpled under her initial assault, providing her the expected quick victory. Instead, he stood there, slightly uncomfortable but fundamentally unaffected, revealing that humans had developed countermeasures against Xylarian psionic abilities. Primitive technology cannot shield you from true power, she declared, deciding to escalate the demonstration. With a gesture that sent waves of light cascading through her armor, Lyranaya lifted several decorative crystalline objects from their pedestals around the hall. They hovered in the air, spinning slowly at first, then faster, creating a dazzling display of light and shadow. With another motion, she caused several small, controlled energy discharges to erupt near Thorn. Harmless but startling flashes designed to showcase her precise control. Human reflexes are so painfully slow, she mocked, her telepathic voice broadcasting to the entire assembly. Your species still relies on nerve impulses traveling through tissue, while we command energy with thought alone. To punctuate her point, she created a psionic illusion of a large predatory creature, similar to an earth lion but with 6 limbs and crystalline fangs, that appeared to lunge at Thorn from his blind spot. The sergeant reacted with surprising composure. He sidestepped the illusory beast with a practiced motion, taking cover behind one of the room's structural columns in a smooth, economical movement that spoke of combat, training, and experience. Not slow enough, it seems, he remarked dryly. Though I appreciate the light show. Very pretty. His dismissive tone sent a flush of genuine anger through Lyranaya. The armor responded to her emotional state, its color deepening toward crimson as energy patterns flowed more rapidly across its surface. You move like an ape climbing trees, she projected, both telepathically and aloud, ensuring all could hear her mockery. Scurrying for cover from threats you barely comprehend. Is this the best the mighty Terran Federation offers? A soldier who hides rather than faces power directly. Thorn remained behind the column, his eyes constantly assessing, watching her movements and the flow of energy through her armor. Facing power directly would be suicide, he replied matter-of-factly. And contrary to what you might believe, Princess, humans haven't survived this long by being stupid. He emerged briefly to dodge another psionic energy discharge, rolling with surprising agility before taking position behind a different column. His movements were economical, almost boring in their practicality. No wasted energy, no dramatic flourishes, just effective evasion. This wasn't going at all as Lyranaya had planned. The ritual was supposed to demonstrate Xylarian superiority through a quick, decisive show of psionic dominance. Instead, this unremarkable human was turning it into a tedious game of cat and mouse, refusing to be properly cowed or impressed. One of the hovering drones recording the ritual drifted near Thorn's position, capturing his muttered words. All that power, and they still haven't figured out the difference between flashy and effective. The comment was picked up by the hall's acoustic enhancement system and broadcast throughout the chamber. Several Xylarian nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Lyranaya's face contorted with increasing frustration. Enough of these childish evasions, she declared. Her armor began to glow more intensely, the neural interface pulsing with increased energy as she prepared a more substantial demonstration of her abilities. The crystals embedded in her armor, particularly those positioned at her temples, sternum, and palms, began to accumulate psionic energy, creating visible distortions in the air around her. The Xylarian nobles leaned forward in anticipation. They recognized the preparations for a mindstorm, a concentrated psionic assault that would overwhelm any normal consciousness, rendering the target temporarily incapacitated without causing permanent damage. It was considered the ultimate demonstration of psionic dominance within the non-lethal parameters of the ritual. Perhaps you will find this less flashy, Lyranaya said, her voice taking on a resonant quality as the psionic energy built to critical levels. Thorn's eyes narrowed as he observed the energy pattern. His hand moved to one of the devices on his belt, a small, unassuming metal cylinder that had registered as a standard communications device during the pre-ritual security scan. As Lyranaya's arms rose in the traditional gesture to release the mindstorm, Thorn pressed a recessed button on the cylinder and rolled it across the floor. It came to rest approximately 3 meters from the princess. She barely spared it a glance, assuming it was some pitiful attempt at distraction. Your primitive devices are... The cylinder emitted a sharp, high-pitched pulse, not aimed at Lyranaya herself, but precisely targeted at the primary resonance crystal in her armor's sternoplate. The pulse matched the exact frequency of the crystal's energy signature, creating an instantaneous feedback loop within the psionic amplification system. The effect was spectacular and immediate. The armor's energy circulation system, designed to amplify and channel psionic energy, suddenly found itself hosting conflicting frequencies. Cascading failures rippled through the neural interface. The primary crystals in her armor flashed brilliantly, blue to white to an almost painful ultraviolet, before shattering with a sound like breaking glass. Lyranaya gasped as the armor that had been a second skin to her since her ascension ceremony literally disintegrated around her body. Shards of crystal and fragments of the living metal substrate fell away, dissolving into motes of light before they hit the floor. The neural interface disengaged with a painful snap of psychic feedback that left her momentarily stunned. In a matter of seconds, the Princess of Xylar stood in the center of the echoing hall, wearing only the simple undergarment worn beneath ceremonial armor. A form-fitting bodysuit of silvery material that, while not revealing by human standards, was practically nakedness by Xylarian cultural norms. The intricate technological marvel that had been the visible symbol of her power and status lay in glittering dust at her feet. A collective gasp, both audible and telepathic, echoed through the hall. Several nobles rose to their feet in shock, while others averted their eyes from the princess's unexpected vulnerability. Thorn himself seemed surprised by the completeness of the armor's failure. He had expected disruption, not destruction. Nevertheless, he maintained his composure, slowly emerging from cover with his hands visible to show he intended no further action. Lyrania's shock quickly transformed into rage. Her natural psionic abilities, while diminished without the armor's amplification, were still considerable. Her eyes blazed with fury as she gathered her raw power, preparing to unleash it directly at the impudent human who had dared to strip away her ceremonial protection. "You dare!" she began, her voice rising to deliver a psionic-enhanced command that could still cause significant pain even without her armor's amplification. Xylarians had evolved to use voice as a secondary psionic channel, allowing their verbal communications to carry telepathic undertones that could influence minds and even, at high intensities, affect physical matter. But before she could complete the psionic vocalization, Thorn activated a second device, this one worn as an unobtrusive wristband. It emitted a focused, directional pulse of what appeared to be golden light, though it was actually a carefully calibrated neural disruption field. The field washed over Lyrania, specifically targeting the neural pathways that connected her speech centers to her psionic abilities. It was a technology originally developed for crowd control during the colony riots on Mars, designed to temporarily prevent violent individuals from coordinating attacks without causing lasting harm. Lyrania's voice cut off mid-syllable. Her mouth continued to move, but no sound emerged. More significantly, she found herself unable to project telepathically. The automatic link between thought and psionic projection temporarily severed by the disruption field. For perhaps the first time in her life, Princess Lyrania of Xylar was completely silent. Not merely quiet, but utterly incapable of projecting her will or words through any medium. The sensation was so alien, so fundamentally wrong to a Xylarian, that she stood frozen in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief and growing horror. The echoing hall, true to its name, fell into absolute silence. No one moved. The Xylarian nobles stared in collective astonishment at the spectacle of their princess, disarmed, unarmored, and silenced, standing before a seemingly unremarkable human soldier who had accomplished all this without once attacking her directly. Thorn stood quietly, maintaining a respectful distance. He made no move to press his advantage or to gloat. After a moment, he simply inclined his head slightly, not quite a bow, but an acknowledgement of sorts, and extended his hand in a gesture that could have been interpreted as an offer of assistance. Lyrania stared at the offered hand as if it were a serpent. Had she been capable of speech, she would have unleashed a torrent of royal fury. Instead, she could only communicate through expression and body language, and the utter contempt and rage in her eyes required no translation in any language of any species. The moment stretched, crystallizing into the kind of diplomatic incident that would be discussed in interstellar relations classrooms for generations to come. Power had been fully inverted, not through superior force, but through the careful application of knowledge and technology precisely where it would be most effective. A Xylarian royal guard captain finally broke the paralysis, stepping forward with a contingent of guards whose ornate crystalline spears were now activated, glowing with barely contained energy. "The ritual is concluded," the captain announced, his voice tight with controlled fury and embarrassment. "The Terran representative will be escorted to his diplomatic quarters immediately." Thorn nodded calmly, deactivating the wristband with a subtle movement. The neural disruption field disappeared, though its effects would take approximately 20 minutes to fully dissipate from Lyrania's nervous system. "Of course," he said evenly. "I meant no disrespect to Her Highness. I was simply participating in the ritual as instructed, a demonstration of cultural capabilities without permanent harm." He allowed himself to be surrounded by the guard contingent, who maintained rigid professionalism despite the obvious desire to skewer the human on their ceremonial weapons. As he was escorted from the hall, Thorn caught one last glimpse of Princess Lyrania, still standing in shocked silence as attendants rushed to cover her with cloaks and usher her from public view. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and intense. Emergency communications channels between Xylar and the Terran Federation headquarters on Europa opened within minutes of the incident. Xylarian representatives formally protested what they termed an unprecedented assault on royal dignity and person, while Terran diplomats countered that Sergeant Thorne had acted fully within the parameters of the ritual, using only defensive measures against what could be interpreted as an escalating psionic attack. Lyranaya was secluded in her private chambers in the eastern wing of the royal spire, attended only by her most trusted handmaidens. The neural disruption had worn off, returning her voice and psionic abilities, but she had maintained her silence by choice, sending away everyone through sharp gestures rather than words or telepathy. She sat now before the vast crystal window overlooking the capital city, its spires and arches glowing with bioluminescent light against the purple twilight. A medical drone hovered discreetly in the corner, monitoring her neural patterns for any lingering effects of the disruption field. Her discarded cloak lay on the floor where she had thrown it upon entering, an uncharacteristic display of disorder for the usually composed princess. For the first time in her life, Lyranaya found herself unable to process her thoughts into coherent patterns. The incident replayed in her mind continuously, not just the humiliation of standing exposed before the court, nor even the terrifying silence imposed upon her, but the methodical way in which the human had stripped away her power. He had not matched her psionic abilities with equivalent power, as would a Xylarian opponent. He had not attempted to overwhelm her defenses with brute force, as might a Carasian warrior. Instead, he had observed, calculated, and systematically targeted the specific technologies and biological capabilities that constituted her advantage. In doing so, he had revealed something profoundly disturbing. Her power was not as intrinsic as she had been raised to believe. It was contingent, dependent on tools and technologies that could be disrupted or disabled. The armor she had worn since her ascension ceremony, the physical manifestation of her royal status and psionic might, had shattered like cheap glass before precisely applied human technology. More unsettling still was the realization that the human had known exactly what he was doing. He had studied Xylarian psionic technology, understood its vulnerabilities, and come prepared with countermeasures specifically designed for this encounter. While she had been mocking his primitiveness, he had been analyzing her capabilities and planning his response. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication on her private channel. Lyranaya considered ignoring it, but the royal cipher indicated it came from her father, the Emperor. Even in her current state, she dared not refuse his call. With a gesture, she activated the communication crystal. No visual appeared, a courtesy to her current disheveled state, but the Emperor's telepathic presence filled the room, strong and stern even across distance. "Daughter," came his formal greeting. "I have reviewed the full recording of the incident." Lyranaya remained silent, unsure what response was expected or appropriate. The human's actions were unexpected, the Emperor continued after a moment. "Our intelligence suggested Terran's psionic countermeasures were primitive and largely theoretical. Clearly, our information was outdated." "They are primitives," Lyranaya finally responded, her telepathic voice smaller than usual but tinged with lingering anger. "He used tricks and devices, not true power." "Indeed," her father agreed, though a subtle undertone suggested he did not entirely share her dismissal. "And yet, his tricks proved effective against your true power. That reality cannot be ignored, however unpleasant." The rebuke, mild as it was, stung sharply. "What will happen now?" she asked. Diplomatically, very little. The ritual's parameters were technically observed. No lasting harm was done. The Terrans are already presenting this as an unfortunate equipment malfunction rather than a deliberate humiliation. They're being surprisingly gracious in victory. That burned worst of all, the idea that the humans would pity her rather than fear her after this disgrace. "And what of the human soldier?" she asked, unable to keep the edge from her thought voice. "Sergeant Thorne has already been transferred to their diplomatic vessel. He will depart Xylar within the hour, returning to his assignment on Europa Station." The Emperor paused. "There will be no reprisals," L'Irania. That would escalate an incident into a diplomatic crisis we cannot afford at present. She wanted to protest, to demand justice or revenge, but found herself unexpectedly hesitant. The memory of standing silent and powerless before the court was still too raw, the shock of vulnerability too fresh. "Understand, father," she responded instead. "Reflect on this experience, daughter," the emperor advised, his telepathic tone softening slightly. "There is wisdom to be gained even in defeat, perhaps especially in defeat. I will expect your presence at the High Council meeting tomorrow. We have much to discuss regarding our approach to human relations moving forward." The communication ended, leaving Lyranaya alone with her thoughts once more. After a long moment of stillness, she rose and approached the artifacts display in her chamber's antechamber. Among the collection of ceremonial items and diplomatic gifts from 100 worlds, she located a small, unassuming data crystal, a comprehensive database on human history and technology that she had been given as part of her diplomatic training, but had barely skimmed, considering it beneath serious study. She activated the crystal, and holographic displays of human technological evolution filled the air around her. For the first time, she looked at these records not with contempt, but with genuine curiosity. How had a species without natural psionic ability managed to develop countermeasures against Xylarian powers? What other capabilities might they possess that Xylarian intelligence had dismissed or underestimated? As the night deepened outside her window, Princess Lyranaya began to study her enemy with new eyes, determined to understand the species that had humbled her. The incident described in hushed whispers throughout the palace, how a common human soldier had stripped a royal princess of her armor and robbed her of speech, would not be forgotten or forgiven, but it would be understood. In his temporary quarters aboard the Terran diplomatic vessel Concordia, Sergeant Marcus Thorne sat completing his official report on the incident. The sterile efficiency of the human ship felt jarringly plain after the organic luxury of the Xylarian palace, but Thorne found himself grateful for the familiarity. "Detail your actions during the ritual of will assertion," prompted the automated report template on his datapad. Thorne sighed, trying to find the right balance between technical accuracy and political sensitivity. How exactly did one explain that he had effectively stripped and silenced an alien princess without triggering an interstellar incident? Responded to escalating psionic demonstration with targeted electromagnetic counterpulses directed at psionic amplification technology, not at the Xylarian representative personally, he typed carefully. When secondary psionic attack was initiated, deployed standard issue neural disruption field to temporarily inhibit aggressive action. All measures employed were non-harmful and within ritual parameters of demonstrating relative capabilities without causing injury. He paused, then added, "Note, Xylarian psionic armor proved unexpectedly vulnerable to frequency matching disruption. Recommend Technical Division review design specifications for possible applications in defensive technology." What he didn't include in the report was the small crystalline fragment he had recovered from the ritual chamber floor, a shard of the princess's armor that had not disintegrated with the rest. It sat now on his desk, catching the light with an iridescent gleam that shifted between blue and violet. Technically, he should have turned it over to the research division for analysis. Instead, he found himself pocketing it as he finished his report. The fragment wasn't just a souvenir of an unusual diplomatic encounter. It represented something more significant, a reminder that beneath the psychic powers, advanced technology, and arrogant certainty of superiority, the Xylarians were vulnerable. Their princess, so confident in her mockery, so certain of her dominance, had been rendered powerless not by matching force with force, but by understanding the systems upon which her power depended and finding their weak points. It was a lesson humanity had learned repeatedly throughout its bloody history, and one that had served Thorne well in his military career. True power often lay not in overwhelming strength, but in knowing exactly where and how to apply limited force for maximum effect. As the Concordia prepared to break orbit from Xylar, Thorn stood at the observation port, gazing down at the swirling violet and azure atmosphere of the alien world. Somewhere below, a young princess was likely still seething with humiliation and rage, her worldview shaken by the encounter. "No hard feelings, Your Highness," he murmured to the distant planet. "Just different kinds of power." The ship's engines engaged, and Xyler began to shrink in the viewport as Earth's diplomatic mission departed for deep space. Sergeant Marcus Thorne turned away from the view, the small crystal fragment secure in his pocket, and prepared for his debriefing with Federation intelligence. The incident was officially closed, but its repercussions would echo through human-Xylarian relations for years to come. In her chambers on Xyler, Princess Lyrania finally activated her voice after hours of self-imposed silence. She dismissed her attendants and stood alone before the star map that dominated one wall of her private study. With a gesture, she magnified the section showing the Sol system, Earth appearing as a small blue dot orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. She could speak now, her voice and psionic abilities fully restored. She could summon attendants, command warships, or simply return to her life of royal privilege. Instead, she chose to stand in contemplative silence, studying the home world of the species that had humbled her so completely. The human's face appeared in her memory, not mocking or triumphant, but watchful, analytical. He had seen her not as a divine being to be worshipped or feared, but as a system of capabilities and vulnerabilities to be understood and, if necessary, counteracted. For the first time in her life, Princess Lyrania of Xyler felt something approaching respect for a being she had considered inferior. It was an uncomfortable feeling, tangled with lingering humiliation and resentment, but undeniably present. "Humans," she whispered aloud, tasting the word as if it were unfamiliar. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears after her hours of silence. Smaller, perhaps, but somehow more genuinely her own without the psionic resonance she typically imbued it with. The tidal event, a young alien princess mocked, disarmed, and silenced, had concluded. But as Lyrania turned from the star map to the human technological database she had begun to study in earnest, she recognized that its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The next time she encountered humans, she would be prepared, not merely with stronger armor or more powerful psionic abilities, but with understanding, the most formidable weapon of all.